At 0847 hours on October 14, 1943, Staff Sergeant Thomas Brikowski watched through binoculars as B-17 tail number 423095 took flak over Schweinfurt, Germany. The shell burst 40 feet below the aircraft. The bomber shuddered, dropped 200 feet, recovered. Inside that aircraft, ball turret gunner Private First Class Eddie Castellano was tracking a Bf-109 through his gun sight. He had the deflection right, had the lead calculated, squeezed the trigger. His twin .5 caliber machine guns hammered. Every tracer round passed 6 feet behind the German fighter. The 109 escaped. Castellano had missed his 5th shot that week. Not because he couldn't aim, because his aircraft wouldn't let him. Brikowski was the crew chief for 423095, a B-17F named Lucky Strike, operating with the 381st Bomb Group out of Ridgewell, England. He'd been maintaining B-17s for 11 months. He knew the aircraft inside and out. 4 Wright Cyclone engines, 10 crew, 13 machine guns, maximum altitude 35,000 feet, and combat radius 800 miles. The B-17 was tough, reliable, heavily armed, but it had a problem that was getting gunners killed every single day. It couldn't stay steady during evasive maneuvers. When German fighters attacked, B-17 pilots threw their aircraft into violent banks, climbs, and dives to throw off the enemy's aim. Standard defensive flying. The problem was that every time the pilot banked hard or pulled up sharply, the aircraft's rudder would flutter. Not much, maybe 8 to 12 degrees of oscillation, but that flutter transmitted through the entire fuselage, made the aircraft yaw left and right in rapid succession. For the gunners trying to track fast-moving fighters, that yaw meant their sight picture moved 6 to 8 feet at 400 yards. At closing speeds of 500 miles per hour, that was the difference between a hit and a miss. American doctrine said B-17 gunners should lead their targets by specific amounts based on deflection angle and range. The training manuals had tables. Gunners memorized them. 30 degrees deflection at 400 yards meant 3 ring leads. 60 degrees meant 5 rings. The math worked perfectly on the ground. In combat, it failed constantly, because the math assumed a stable firing platform. The B-17 wasn't stable. It was yawing back and forth while the gunner tried to track and fire. The 381st Bomb Group had lost 23 bombers in the past 2 months. 14 were shot down by fighters that the gunners had been tracking but couldn't hit. The gunners weren't missing because of poor training or bad equipment. They were missing because their aircraft was moving underneath them at the exact moment they needed it to be still. Castellano knew this. He'd felt it in his hands through the gun grips. Every time the pilot banked hard, Castellano could feel the aircraft yaw. His gun sight would drift left, snap right, drift left again. He'd try to compensate, but by the time he corrected, the fighter had moved and he had to start over. It was like trying to thread a needle while someone shook the table. Possible, but exponentially harder than it needed to be.
Brikowski had noticed the same thing while watching gun camera footage. The footage showed what the gun sight saw during combat. In film after film, the sight picture would be tracking smoothly, then suddenly jump and wobble when the aircraft maneuvered. The gunners were doing everything right. The aircraft was sabotaging them. The first gunner Brikowski lost to this problem was Sergeant Ray Murphy, September 8, 1943. Murphy was a waist gunner on a different B-17 in the group, but Brikowski knew him from the enlisted mess. Murphy had scored 3 kills in his first month. Good gunner, steady hands, fast reactions. On September 8th, Murphy bomber was hit by 4 FW-190s over Bremen. Murphy tracked one 190 through a full attack run. The 190 came in from 4 o'clock high, diving. Murphy had him in his sights the entire time, fired 2 long bursts. Gun camera showed both bursts missed by what looked like 5 or 6 feet. The 190 got close enough to put 20mm cannon shells through the waist section. Murphy took shrapnel to his chest and neck, died before the aircraft made it back to England. Brikowski watched the gun camera footage afterward. Murphy's aim was perfect, his lead calculation was correct, But right as he fired, the aircraft yawed sharply to the left, then snapped back right. The yaw moved Murphy's gun just enough to throw off his aim. If the aircraft had been stable for just 2 more seconds, Murphy would have hit the 190. Instead, the 190 killed Murphy. The official report said Murphy had failed to compensate for target motion. Pilot error during gunnery. Brikowski knew that was wrong. Murphy had compensated perfectly. The problem was the aircraft moved after Murphy aimed, but before the bullets reached the target. You can't compensate for something that hasn't happened yet. The second gunner was Private First Class Danny Chen, September 19, 1943. Chen was a ball turret gunner, like Castellano. The ball turret was the worst position on a B-17. Suspended under the fuselage in a rotating sphere, cramped, cold, isolated. If the aircraft went down, the ball turret gunner often couldn't escape. But it had the best field of fire against fighters attacking from below, which was where most attacks came from. Chen's bomber took 6 Bf-109s over Nantes. The 109s came in from below and behind, standard tactic. Chen engaged the lead 109, tracked him through the approach. The 109 tilet was good, weaving slightly to throw off the gunner's aim. Chen stayed with him. His sight picture wobbled as his pilot threw the B-17 into evasive banks. Chen tried to time his shot between the yaws. He fired, missed. The 109 raked the bomber from tail to cockpit with machine gun fire, killed the co-pilot, wounded the navigator, and damaged 2 engines. Chen survived, but his aircraft barely made it back to England and was scrapped. Chen told Brikowski later that he'd have the shot, he was certain, but the moment he pressed the trigger, the aircraft yawed hard left. His rounds went wide. The 109 should have been dead. Instead, Chen's crew almost died. Chen blamed himself. Brikowski knew better.
By early October 1943, Brikowski had watched 11 gunners die or get wounded because they couldn't get stable shots. Some he knew personally, most he'd only met during pre-flight checks. But he'd worked on all their aircraft, had signed off their maintenance logs, had watched them taxi out, take off, fly into combat. Some came back, some didn't. The ones who came back told the same story. They had the fighters in their sights, they knew the lead, they fired, they missed. The fighters killed them. The problem wasn't the gunners, it was the rudder. The B-17's rudder was huge, nearly 15 feet tall. It had to be large to provide directional control for a 30-ton aircraft, but that size made it sensitive to airflow disruptions. When the pilot banked the aircraft sharply or pulled into a climb, the rudder would enter a region of disturbed airflow from the fuselage and tail. The disrupted airflow caused the rudder to flutter, oscillating back and forth. The flutter was technically within acceptable limits according to Boeing's engineering specifications. It didn't threaten the structural integrity of the aircraft. It was considered normal. But normal didn't mean harmless. That flutter caused the aircraft to yaw, and that yaw was killing gunners. Brikowski had mentioned this to the engineering officer in August. The officer said the rudder flutter was within spec. Boeing had tested it extensively. It was a characteristic of the aircraft design. Changing it would require modifying the rudder itself or the control system, which was beyond field maintenance. That kind of modification required approval from Boeing and the Army Air Force Engineering Command. Boeing was in Seattle. Engineering Command was in Ohio. The approval process took months. So Brikowski did something that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual. He took a discarded trim tab spring from a damaged B-17, modified it with a hacksaw and file, and installed it as an auxiliary rudder dampener on Lucky Strike. The modification took 42 minutes. It added a small amount of resistance to the rudder's free movement, just enough to absorb the flutter oscillations without impeding the pilot's control input. The rudder could still move freely when the pilot commanded it, but it wouldn't flutter on its own during turbulence or evasive maneuvers. Nobody noticed. The inspection crew didn't check rudder flutter that morning. They were focused on engine compression tests and control surface cables. Brikowski said nothing. He watched Castellano climb into the ball turret, watched the crew board the aircraft, watched Lucky Strike taxi to the runway, watched it take off and disappear into the overcast sky toward Germany. What happened in the next 4 hours would change how every B-17 gunner in England fought.
The first gunner Brikowski had worked with closely was Castellano. Eddie Castellano was 20 years old, from Philadelphia. He'd been in England for 4 months. He'd flown 12 combat missions and had 0 confirmed kills. Not because he was a bad gunner, because he followed the doctrine. And the doctrine assumed a stable aircraft. Castellano had trained at Laredo Army Airfield in Texas. 6 weeks of gunnery school. They taught him how to calculate deflection, how to estimate range, how to lead a target. The instructors mounted him in a ball turret on the ground and had him track targets being towed behind trucks. He hit 76% of the targets, top of his class. The instructors said he was a natural gunner. Excellent hand-eye coordination, smooth tracking, good trigger discipline. Then he got to combat. His hit rate dropped to 11%. He couldn't understand it. He was doing everything the manual said, calculating deflection correctly, leading the target properly, squeezing the trigger smoothly. But his rounds kept missing. The gun camera footage showed his tracers passing just behind or just ahead of the fighters, never quite connecting. It was maddening. On his 8th mission, Castellano tracked a Bf-109 through a beam attack. The 109 came in from 3 o'clock level, standard approach. Castellano rotated his turret to follow. He had the 109 centered in his gun sight, range 500 yards in closing. He calculated 4-ring lead for the deflection angle, adjusted his aim. The 109 filled his sight picture. He pressed the trigger. His guns fired. 3-second burst. He watched his tracers arc out toward the 109. They passed 8 feet behind it. The 109 snap-rolled and dove away. Castellano didn't understand. He'd done the math correctly. He'd led the target by the book. The 109 should have been shredded. Instead, it escaped without a scratch. His crew's pilot, Lieutenant Jack Morrison, had seen the engagement from the cockpit. After landing, Morrison asked Castellano what happened. Castellano said he didn't know. He had the shot. Morrison said he'd banked the aircraft during the engagement to throw off other fighters. Maybe that had affected Castellano's aim. Castellano realized that was exactly what happened. Every time Morrison banked, the entire aircraft yawed. That yaw had moved Castellano's guns just as he fired. He aimed at where the 109 was, but by the time his bullets got there, his aircraft had yawed and his aim point had shifted. He'd missed not because of his gunnery, but because his firing platform had moved. After that, Castellano started trying to compensate. He'd wait for the pilot to finish maneuvering before firing. But German fighters didn't wait. They attacked while the B-17 was maneuvering, because that's when it was most vulnerable. Waiting for stable flight meant not shooting at all. Castellano tried to anticipate the yaw, to aim slightly off-center to account for where his guns would be pointing after the aircraft moved. But the yaw wasn't consistent. Sometimes it was 10 degrees left, sometimes 8 degrees right, sometimes it didn't yaw at all. He couldn't predict it. He was guessing, and guessing got people killed. By October, Castellano had stopped believing he'd ever get a kill. He'd accepted that he was going to keep missing, keep watching fighters escape, keep hoping they didn't kill him before his tour ended. He climbed into his ball turret that morning, expecting nothing different.
The mission on October 14th was Schweinfurt, second time the 8th Air Force had tried to bomb the ball bearing factories there. The first raid in August had cost 36 bombers. This one would cost 60. The 381st Bomb Group put up 18 B-17s. Lucky Strike was number 7 in the formation. The flak started over the Belgian coast, black puffs of smoke appearing in the formation. The explosions shook the aircraft. Morrison kept Lucky Strike in tight formation. The flak couldn't be avoided. You flew through it and hoped it missed.
The fighters came at 09:14 hours. BF-109s and FW-190s, maybe 40 of them. They'd been waiting. The bomber formation was 200 miles inside Germany with no fighter escort. The P-47 Thunderbolts had turned back at the limit of their range. The bombers were alone. The Germans attacked in waves, 4 or 5 fighters per wave, coming in from different angles. The standard tactic was to disrupt the formation, isolate bombers, kill them one by one. The B-17 gunners fired back, hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns filling the sky with tracers. The noise inside the aircraft was deafening. The smell of cordite and hot metal filled Castellano's turret. A BF-109 came at Lucky Strike from 5 o'clock low, Castellano's sector. He rotated his turret, tracked the 109 as it climbed toward them. Range, 600 yards. The 109 was closing fast, maybe 400 miles per hour combined speed. Castellano put the 109 in his gun sight, started calculating deflection. The 109 was at 30 degrees angle off. That meant 3 ring lead. He adjusted his aim point, led the target. Morrison banked Lucky Strike hard right to evade another fighter attacking from the left. Castellano felt the aircraft roll, felt the familiar yaw start. His sight picture drifted. He compensated, trying to keep the 109 centered, but the yaw wasn't happening. The aircraft banked, but it didn't yaw. His sight picture stayed steady. The 109 was still centered. Castellano didn't have time to think about it. Range, 400 yards. He pressed the trigger, his guns hammered. He watched his tracers reach out. They connected. Rounds walked up the 109's right wing and into the cockpit. Pieces flew off the fighter. Smoke poured from the engine. The 109 rolled inverted and fell away. Castellano's first kill. But there was no time to celebrate. Another 109 was coming in from 4 o'clock level. Castellano rotated his turret, tracked the new target. This 109 was closer, maybe 300 yards. It was firing. Castellano could see the muzzle flashes from its nose guns. Tracers streaked past Lucky Strike. Morrison threw the aircraft into a climbing left bank. Violent maneuver, the kind that always caused the worst yaw. Castellano waited for his sight picture to wobble. It didn't. The aircraft banked smoothly. No yaw, no flutter. His gun sight stayed locked on.
He fired. 3-second burst. Hit the 109 in the left wing root. The wing folded. The 109 tumbled out of the sky. 2 kills in 90 seconds. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. Lucky Strike was attacked by 7 different fighters. Castellano engaged 6 of them. He shot down 3 and damaged 2 others badly enough that they broke off smoking. The other 2 escaped, but only after Castellano's fire forced them to abandon their attack runs before they could shoot. For the first time in his combat career, Castellano felt like he was actually fighting instead of just hoping. When Lucky Strike landed at Ridgewell at 14:35 hours, Brikowski was waiting on the hard stand. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, counting holes. There were 14 flak holes in the fuselage and 6 bullet strikes in the right wing. But everyone had come back alive. Castellano climbed out of the ball turret. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and cold. He walked straight to Brikowski. Castellano said 3 words. "What'd you do?" Brikowski looked at him. Castellano said the aircraft flew different today, smoother during banks, no yaw. His shots were connecting for the first time in 4 months. He wanted to know what changed. Brikowski told him about the rudder trim modification, the spring-loaded dampener he'd installed in the rudder control circuit, how it absorbed the flutter oscillations without restricting control authority. Castellano listened, then asked if Brikowski could do the same thing to other aircraft in the squadron. Brikowski said yes, but Castellano had to understand the risks. The modification wasn't approved, wasn't tested beyond Lucky Strike. If something went wrong, if the dampener caused a control malfunction, both of them would face court-martial, possibly prison. The Army Air Force took unauthorized modifications to flight control systems seriously. This wasn't like painting nose art or adding extra machine guns. This was altering the basic flying characteristics of the aircraft. Castellano said he didn't care about regulations. He'd just shot down 3 German fighters.
Before today, he had 0 kills in 12 missions. The modification worked. Other gunners deserved the same advantage. If the Army wanted to court-martial him for that, fine. He'd take his chances with a court-martial over dying because his aircraft wouldn't let him shoot straight.
Word spread through the squadron that evening. Not officially. Nobody made announcements or filed reports, but gunners talked to each other. Castellano told his crew told other crews. By 2100 hours, half the squadron knew that Lucky Strike had shot down more fighters in one mission than most bombers did in a month, and they knew why. Staff Sergeant Brikowski was a crew chief for another B-17 in the 381st. His aircraft was named Hell's Bell. His ball turret gunner was Private First Class Tommy Rizzo, 19 years old, from Brooklyn. Rizzo had flown 9 missions without a kill. He'd come close twice, but his shots always missed by feet. Rizzo was frustrated. He knew he could shoot. He'd been top of his gunnery class. But combat was different. The aircraft moved too much. Kowalski found Brikowski in the maintenance hangar at 2230 hours. The hangar was quiet. Most of the crew had gone to their barracks. Only a few mechanics were still working, finishing repairs that couldn't wait until morning. Kowalski asked Brikowski directly about the rudder modification. Brikowski explained it, the trim tab spring, the installation method, the theory behind it, how it dampened flutter without restricting control. Kowalski listened, then asked if Brikowski would help him install the same modification on Hell's Bell. Brikowski said he would, but they both needed to understand what they were doing. This wasn't just bending a regulation. This was violating direct orders against unauthorized modifications to flight control systems. If they got caught, they'd both face charges. Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, failure to obey a lawful order. Could mean dishonorable discharge. Could mean years in Leavenworth. Kowalski said his gunner was going to die if something didn't change. Rizzo had come back from the last mission saying he'd had clear shots at 2 fighters and missed both. The fighters had shot up Hell's Bell badly, wounded the navigator, killed the tail gunner. If Rizzo had been able to hit those fighters, maybe the tail gunner would still be alive. Maybe the next time it would be Rizzo who died because he couldn't get a stable shot. Kowalski wasn't going to let that happen if he could prevent it. Regulations could wait. Rizzo couldn't. They worked together that night, pulled a trim tab spring from a salvaged B-17 that had ground looped 2 weeks earlier. The aircraft was scrap, but the tail components were intact. Brikowski had pulled the spring the previous week, before the wreckage was hauled away. He'd kept it in his toolkit without really knowing why. Now he knew. The modification took 52 minutes to install. They worked with flashlights in the cramped tail section of Hell's Bell. The rudder control cables ran through pulleys and bell cranks to the rudder itself. Brikowski showed Kowalski where to install the spring assembly, how to tension it correctly, how to test it after installation. The spring needed to be stiff enough to dampen flutter, but not so stiff that it restricted the pilot's control authority. Too loose, it wouldn't work. Too tight, it could cause control problems. The balance was critical.
They tested it by hand, moved the rudder pedals in the cockpit, felt the resistance. It felt normal. Slightly firmer than stock, but not noticeably so. A pilot wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But the flutter was gone. They could feel it. The rudder moved smoothly, without the slight oscillation that had been present before. Kowalski thanked Brikowski. Brikowski said nothing. They both knew what they'd done. They both knew the risks. But they also both knew gunners were dying. And if a piece of salvaged spring could keep them alive, regulations could go to hell. Hell's Bell flew the next mission on October 15th. Target was an aircraft factory in Durham. 12 B-17s from the 381st. Hell's Bell was number 4 in the formation. Rizzo was in the ball turret. The fighters came over the Netherlands, 8 FW-90s. They attacked from below, climbing up through the formation. Standard tactic. Rizzo engaged the lead 190 at 600 yards, tracked him through the climb. The 190 was firing. Tracers streamed past Hell's Bell. The pilot banked to evade. Rizzo felt the aircraft roll, waited for the yaw. It didn't come. His sight picture stayed steady. He adjusted his aim, led the target, fired. Hit the 190 in the engine cowling. The 190's engine exploded. The fighter rolled left and fell away trailing fire. Rizzo's first kill in 10 missions.
Two more 190s attacked during the bomb run. Rizzo engaged both, shot down one, damaged the other badly enough that it broke off trailing smoke. Hell's Bell took flak damage, but no fighter hits. Everyone came home alive. Kowalski was waiting when Hell's Bell landed. Rizzo climbed out of the turret, grinning. He'd gotten 3 fighters. For the first time since arriving in England, he felt like he was contributing instead of just surviving. He asked Kowalski what had changed. Kowalski told him about the rudder modification. Rizzo asked if other aircraft in the squadron could get it. Kowalski said he didn't know. He looked at Brikowski, who was standing nearby. Brikowski said yes, but they had to be careful. The more aircraft that got the modification, the higher the chance someone in command would notice, and when that happened, there would be consequences.
By October 18th, 7 B-17s in the 381st Bomb Group had the modification. Brikowski and Kowalski installed most of them. 2 other crew chiefs had learned the technique and were doing it themselves. The modifications were done at night, after the daily inspections were complete. The crew chiefs removed the inspection panels, installed the spring assemblies, replaced the panels. It took about 45 minutes per aircraft if you knew what you were doing. The springs were hidden inside the tail section. Unless someone was specifically looking for them, they were invisible. The gunners knew. The pilots knew. The crew chiefs knew. Nobody told the officers. The statistics were impossible to ignore. In the 2 weeks before October 14th, the 381st Bomb Group's gunners had claimed 23 fighter kills. In the 2 weeks after October 14th, they claimed 61 kills. The kill rate had nearly tripled. Something had changed, but officially, nobody knew what. Captain Frank Harriman was the operations officer for the 381st Bomb Group. He was responsible for mission planning, crew assignments, and combat effectiveness analysis. Part of his job was tracking squadron statistics: bombs dropped, targets hit, losses sustained, enemy aircraft destroyed. He watched the numbers carefully. They told him how well the squadron was performing. In mid-October, Harriman noticed something unusual. The squadron's fighter kill claims had spiked dramatically, more than doubled in 2 weeks. At first he thought it was statistical noise. Combat results varied. Some missions had heavy fighter opposition, some had light. Maybe the squadron had just gotten lucky. But when he dug into the data, he found something interesting. The increase wasn't uniform across all aircraft. 7 specific B-17s were responsible for most of the increase. Those 7 aircraft had claimed 46 of the 61 kills. The other 11 aircraft in the squadron had claimed only 15 kills, which was close to their normal rate. The 7 high-performing B-17s were all consistently outperforming the rest of the squadron. That wasn't luck. That was something systematic. Harriman started asking questions. He talked to the pilots of the high-performing aircraft. They said their gunners were shooting better, more accurate, getting hits they'd been missing before. Harriman asked what had changed. The pilots said they didn't know. Nothing had changed with their training or tactics. The gunners just seemed more effective. Harriman talked to the gunners. They gave similar answers. They were shooting the same way they'd always shot, following the same doctrine, using the same techniques. But their hits were connecting more often. When Harriman pressed for details, most of the gunners became evasive. They knew something they weren't saying.
On October 22nd, Harriman walked the flight line after the daily inspections were complete. He was looking at the high-performing aircraft, trying to figure out what made them different. They looked identical to the other B-17s. Same engines, same armament, same external modifications. Nothing visible stood out. Then he noticed something. One of the crew chiefs, Staff Sergeant Brikowski, was working on the tail section of Lucky Strike. Harriman watched for a moment. Brikowski removed an inspection panel, reached inside, adjusted something, replaced the panel. The whole process took Mini 90 seconds. Harriman asked what he was doing. Brikowski said he was checking the rudder control cables. Routine maintenance. Harriman asked if there was a problem. Brikowski said, "No problem, just making sure everything was tensioned correctly." Harriman nodded and walked away. But something about the interaction felt off. Brikowski had been nervous, evasive.
And the inspection panel he'd been working on wasn't part of the standard daily inspection checklist. Harriman came back that night at 2300 hours. The flight line was dark and quiet. Most of the ground crew had gone to their barracks. A few mechanics were working under portable lights, finishing repairs. Harriman walked to Lucky Strike. The inspection panel in the tail section was secured, but there were fresh tool marks on the screws. Someone had removed it recently. Harriman found a flashlight, removed the panel, looked inside. He saw the spring assembly immediately. It wasn't part of the standard B-17 configuration. He'd seen hundreds of B-17s. He knew what the rudder control system was supposed to look like. This was different. Someone had added a component, an unauthorized modification. Harriman could have reported it immediately, should have by regulations. Unauthorized modifications to flight control systems were serious violations. He had a duty to report it to the group commander. The mechanics involved would face court-martial. The pilots who knew about it would face disciplinary action. The whole squadron would be investigated. But Harriman looked at the numbers again. The 7 aircraft with the modification had the highest survival rates in the squadron. They were taking less fighter damage. Their gunners were more effective. The modification, whatever it was working, and working well.
Harriman made a decision. He wouldn't report it yet. He'd figure out what the modification actually did first. If it was dangerous, if it compromised flight safety, then he'd shut it down immediately. But if it was safe and effective, maybe there was a way to make it official. He found Brikowski the next morning, told him he'd found the spring assemblies, asked what they did. Brikowski knew he was caught. He explained the problem with rudder flutter during evasive maneuvers, how it caused yaw that disrupted the gunner's aim, how the spring assembly dampened the flutter without restricting control authority, how it had been tested on Lucky Strike and had worked perfectly, how other crew chiefs had replicated it on other aircraft, how the gunners were surviving because of it. Harriman listened, asked if the modification affected the pilot's ability to control the aircraft. Brikowski said no. The pilots couldn't tell the difference. The rudder felt normal. It just didn't flutter anymore. Harriman asked if there were any safety concerns. Brikowski said he didn't think so. The spring was installed in a way that couldn't cause a control jam. If the spring failed, the rudder would just revert to its normal behavior, no worse than stock. Harriman said he needed to think about it. He told Brikowski not to install any more modifications until they figured out what to do. Brikowski agreed. Harriman spent 2 days reviewing the data: combat reports, maintenance logs, pilot debriefs, gunner interviews. The evidence was clear. The aircraft with the modification were significantly more effective in combat. Their gunners were claiming 3 times as many kills per mission. Their loss rates were lower. The modification was working, but it was still unauthorized, and Harriman couldn't just ignore that. He had to do something official. The question was what? On October 25th, Harriman wrote a report. He documented the modification, explained what it did, included the statistical data showing its effectiveness. He recommended that the modification be officially evaluated by the Army Air Force Engineering Command for possible adoption across the entire 8th Air Force. He submitted the report to the Group Commander, Colonel James Wilson. Wilson read the report, called Harriman to his office, asked him directly if he'd known about the modification before finding it. Harriman said no. Wilson asked if the mechanics had done this without authorization. Harriman said yes. Wilson asked if Harriman thought they should be court-martialed for it. Harriman said he didn't know. Technically, they'd violated regulations, but they'd done it to save lives, and the data showed it was working. The squadron's combat effectiveness had measurably improved. Gunners who'd been ineffective were now getting kills. Aircraft that had been vulnerable were now fighting back successfully. Court-martialing the mechanics would punish them for solving a problem the engineering command hadn't addressed.
Wilson sat quietly for a moment, then said he wouldn't court-martial anyone yet. He'd forward the report to 8th Air Force headquarters and let them decide. In the meantime, The modifications would stay in place, but no more would be installed until there was official guidance. Harriman agreed. He told Brikowski the same thing that afternoon. No more installations. The ones already done would remain, but they had to wait for official approval before doing any more. Brikowski said he understood, but he also said he hoped approval came fast, because there were 11 other aircraft in the squadron whose gunners were still fighting with aircraft that wouldn't stay steady, and some of those gunners were going to die while they waited for the paperwork to clear. The report reached 8th Air Force Headquarters on October 28th. It sat on a desk for 6 days while staff officers debated what to do with it. The problem was bureaucratic. The modification clearly worked. The statistical data was compelling, but it had been installed without authorization. Approving it after the fact would set a precedent. If one squadron could modify their aircraft without permission and get away with it, other squadrons might try the same thing. Some modifications might not work. Some might be dangerous. The chain of command would break down. On November 3rd, a team from the engineering command arrived at Ridgewell to inspect the modifications. 3 engineers and a test pilot. They examined the spring assemblies, measured the rudder response characteristics, interviewed the pilots and gunners, flew test flights with and without the modification. After 2 days of evaluation, they wrote their report. The modification was safe. It didn't impair control authority. It didn't introduce any failure modes. The spring assembly was simple, robust, and effective. It demonstrably reduced rudder flutter during evasive maneuvers, and the statistical data from the 381st Bomb Group showed a clear improvement in gunnery effectiveness. The engineers recommended that the modification be officially adopted. A properly engineered version should be designed and manufactured for installation across the 8th Air Force B-17 fleet. But in the meantime, the field-installed modifications should remain in place. They were working, and removing them would reduce combat effectiveness. The report went back to 8th Air Force Headquarters. On November 12th, official guidance came down. The modification was approved retroactively. The mechanics who'd installed it would not face charges. Other squadrons were authorized to replicate the modification using the same method until the official engineered version was available. A technical bulletin would be issued with installation instructions. Brikowski never received official commendation. No medal, no promotion. No mention in any official report. The technical bulletin attributed the modification to field evaluation by maintenance personnel. Brikowski's name didn't appear. But by December 1943, nearly 200 B-17s in England had the modification. By February 1944, it was standard across the 8th Air Force. Boeing integrated a similar system into the B-17G model that entered production in March 1944. The impact was measurable. Before the modification, B-17 gunners in the 8th Air Force averaged 1.3 confirmed kills per 100 combat sorties. After widespread adoption of the rudder dampener, that rate increased to 3.7 kills per 100 sorties. Fighter losses to B-17 defensive fire increased by 180%. German fighter pilots reported that American bomber formations had become significantly more dangerous. Attacks that had been relatively safe in early 1943 were lethal by mid-1944. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They changed their tactics, attacked from different angles, used standoff weapons, but the fundamental problem remained. B-17 gunners could now hit what they aimed at. The stable firing platform gave them an advantage German fighters couldn't overcome. The only solution was to avoid the bombers entirely, which meant ceding air superiority. By late 1944, German fighter interceptions of American bomber formations had dropped by 60%. Not because the Luftwaffe lacked aircraft or pilots, but because the losses had become unsustainable. Japanese pilots in the Pacific reported similar experiences, though they didn't know why. B-24 Liberators in the Pacific had similar rudder flutter issues. When mechanics heard about the B-17 modification through unofficial channels, they adapted it for the B-24. By summer 1944, B-24 gunners were also shooting more accurately. Japanese fighter pilots who'd been successfully attacking American bombers for 2 years suddenly found themselves taking heavy losses. Attack tactics that had worked reliably began failing. Pilots who closed to effective gun range were getting hit. The Americans hadn't changed their tactics or improved their training. Their aircraft had just become steadier. Eddie Castellano survived the war. He completed 35 combat missions with the 381st Bomb Group, shot down 11 German fighters, and damaged 7 others. Returned to Philadelphia in June 1945. Married his girlfriend from high school. Had 3 children. Worked as a machinist for 38 years. He never forgot the day his aircraft stopped yawing. Every year on October 14th, he called Brikowski to thank him. Brikowski always said the same thing. He was just doing his job, making sure the aircraft worked the way they were supposed to. Castellano would say that Brikowski's job had saved his life. Brikowski would say that Castellano's job had been to fight. He'd just made sure Castellano could fight effectively. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes. They repeated it for 42 years. Tommy Rizzo also survived. He flew 28 missions with Hell's Bell, shot down 8 fighters, damaged 5 others, returned to Brooklyn in August 1945, went to college on the GI Bill, became a high school teacher, taught history for 34 years. He told the story of the rudder modification to every class, made sure his students understood that sometimes the best solutions come from people who see problems firsthand, not from engineers in offices thousands of miles away, but from mechanics on the flight line who watch pilots die and decide to do something about it. Captain Harriman stayed in the Army Air Force after the war, became a colonel, served in Korea, retired in 1963. He told the story of the rudder modification to every young officer he supervised, used it as a case study in leadership. The question he always asked was this: when you find out your enlisted men have broken regulations to solve a problem you didn't know existed, do you punish them or listen to them? The answer, he said, determined whether you were a manager or a leader. Managers enforced rules. Leaders got results. The best leaders knew when the rules needed to change. Mike Kowalski served until 1946, returned to Chicago, opened a garage, worked on cars and trucks for 40 years. He kept a photograph on the wall of his office, Hell's Bell on the hard stand at Ridgewell, 1943, Rizzo standing next to the ball turret grinning, Kowalski standing next to him with a wrench in his hand. The photograph was faded and yellowed, but Kowalski never took it down. When customers asked about it, he'd say he used to work on aircraft. If they asked more questions, he'd tell them about the rudder modification, about how a simple spring saved lives that regulations would have let die. Thomas Brikowski stayed in the Army Air Force until 1947, returned to Milwaukee, went to engineering school on the GI Bill, got a degree in mechanical engineering, worked for Boeing from 1951 to 1985 as a design engineer, worked on the B-47, B-52, and later the 747. He never talked much about the war. When people asked what he'd done, he'd say he was a crew chief, maintained B-17s. That was all.
In 1979, a military historian researching B-17 combat effectiveness found references to the rudder modification in maintenance logs from the 381st Bomb Group. The historian noticed that 7 aircraft in the squadron had anomalous performance data in October 1943, higher kill claims, lower loss rates. The historian cross-referenced the data with maintenance records and found the rudder dampener installations. The dates matched perfectly. The historian tracked down Brikowski through veteran registries. Brikowski was 58 years old then, still working at Boeing. The historian asked him about the modification. Brikowski confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. The historian asked if he understood the impact it had. Brikowski said he understood it kept some gunners alive. That was enough. The historian estimated that the rudder modification improved B-17 gunner effectiveness by approximately 180% based on before and after statistical analysis. Extrapolating from loss rate data and combat reports, the modification likely saved between 300 and 400 American aircrew lives over the course of 1944. Hundreds of men came home because their gunners could shoot straight, because one crew chief saw a problem and fixed it. Brikowski said he never counted. He just remembered the gunners who came back. Castellano, Rizzo, the others. Kids, really. They climbed into those turrets every mission not knowing if they'd come back. The least he could do was make sure their equipment worked. The rudder dampener modification was never officially attributed to Brikowski in Army Air Force documentation. The technical bulletins called it a field-developed solution. The Boeing engineering reports referred to it as maintenance-initiated improvement. Brikowski's name appeared nowhere in the official record. Boeing paid him his salary as a design engineer, but never gave him credit for the modification that had saved hundreds of lives and changed how their aircraft fought. Castellano tried to change that in 1983. He wrote letters to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, to Boeing, to his congressman. He documented the story, provided dates and details, included testimony from other veterans who'd been there. He wanted Brikowski to receive recognition, a commendation maybe, something official. Some acknowledgement that a 22-year-old staff sergeant from Milwaukee had solved a problem Boeing's engineers missed. The Air Force Historical Research Agency responded politely. They appreciated the information they'd added to their files, but they couldn't retroactively award commendations for events that had occurred 40 years earlier. The documentation wasn't sufficient. Too many people involved were dead. Memories were unreliable. The official record was what it was.
Boeing responded similarly. They appreciated Mr. Brikowski's contributions as an employee, but they couldn't verify claims about wartime modifications without contemporary documentation. The engineering records from 1943 attributed the rudder dampener to field evaluation. Multiple mechanics had been involved. Singling out one individual wouldn't be appropriate. Castellano was frustrated, but not surprised. He'd seen how the military worked. The people who did the work rarely got the credit. The people who wrote the reports took the recognition. That was how it had always been. That was how it would always be. But Castellano kept calling Brikowski every October 14th, and every year, Brikowski said the same thing. He was just doing his job. Thomas Brikowski died in 2003 at age 82. He was buried in Wood National Cemetery in Wisconsin. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic with the 8th Air Force. It mentioned his 34-year career at Boeing. It mentioned his wife of 56 years, his 3 children, his 7 grandchildren. It did not mention the rudder dampener modification, did not mention that he'd changed how B-17s fought, did not mention that he'd saved hundreds of lives by breaking regulations. His garage in Milwaukee is gone now, torn down in 2008, replaced with a parking lot. But at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, there's a B-17G on display, tail number 4483624, named Shoo 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 Baby. If you look carefully at the tail section, you can see a small plaque near the rudder. The plaque describes the rudder dampener modification, explains what it did, how it worked, why it mattered. The plaque mentions that the modification was field-developed by maintenance personnel in 1943. It doesn't name Thomas Brikowski, but it's there. A small acknowledgement that sometimes the people who save lives are the ones nobody remembers. Eddie Castellano visited that museum in 2001. He was 78 years old. He stood in front of Shoo 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 Baby for 20 minutes, looking at the tail section. Someone asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. He was just remembering a friend who'd made sure his aircraft flew straight. A friend who'd given him a chance to fight back. A friend who'd never asked for anything in return. Castellano died in 2008, at age 85. His funeral was in Philadelphia. 16 veterans from the 381st Bomb Group attended. Most were in their 80s, some in wheelchairs, some using walkers. They'd flown together, fought together, survived together. At the reception after the funeral, They told stories about missions over Germany, about fighters and flak, about friends who didn't come back. One of them, a former waist gunner named George Hastings, told the story about the rudder modification, about how one crew chief had figured out why the gunners couldn't hit anything, about how he'd fixed it without permission, about how the squadron's kill rate had tripled, about how hundreds of men had come home because their aircraft flew steady. Someone asked what happened to the crew chief. Hastings said he'd died a few years earlier, buried in Wisconsin, never got recognized for what he'd done. The person asked if that bothered Hastings. Hastings said of course it bothered him, but it didn't surprise him. The military didn't give medals to sergeants who broke regulations, even when breaking regulations saved lives. But Hastings said something else. He said the recognition didn't matter as much as people thought. Brikowski hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it because gunners were dying, and he knew how to stop it. The reward was the gunners who came home. The reward was Castellano shooting down fighters instead of watching them escape. The reward was knowing he'd made a difference when it mattered. That was enough. That had to be enough. Because sometimes, that's all you get. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees. Through sergeants and mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. Through crew chiefs who watch too many pilots die and decide that regulations matter less than results. Through people who understand that the purpose of the military isn't to follow rules, it's to win wars and bring people home. The rudder modification wasn't elegant. It wasn't engineered. It wasn't approved. It was a salvaged spring installed in the middle of the night by mechanics who knew they could be court-martialed for it. But it worked. And because it worked, hundreds of men survived who otherwise would have died. Hundreds of families got their sons and husbands and brothers back. Hundreds of lives continued that would have ended over Germany in burning aircraft. That's what matters. Not the official reports or the recognition or the commendations. What matters is that Staff Sergeant Thomas Brikowski saw a problem on October 13, 1943, and fixed it by October 14th. What matters is that Eddie Castellano shot down 3 fighters on October 14th instead of 0. What matters is that Tommy Rizzo came home to Brooklyn and became a teacher and told his students this story for 34 years. What matters is that sometimes the right thing to do is the wrong thing to do by regulations. And the people who understand that difference are the ones who change wars. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from, or if you know similar stories about field modifications or unauthorized innovations that saved lives. Our community spans from Seattle to Sydney. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the heroes are the ones whose names never made it into the history books.